We met last time at the DVDs.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm good. You? Yeah?
Usually they just put up space and put space in. Probably the Idps book.
I'm very surprised. Let's listen to that.
Let's give them a call.
Yes.
Normally they create on a very regular basis like
there has been, but I'll tell you because there has been an incident with a special rapporteur, Champagne, who was not clean one day when she arrived after somebody else. And just immediately opened. Yeah. Okay, but perhaps I do here. It's you have to be not to be too fat. Okay. Bonjour. My speech will not be in French, unfortunately, but nevertheless, so it's my pleasure to welcome the director of the Geneva Academy and director of the LM program. We have here the director of the Master of Transitional Justice program. So it's our pleasure, our common pleasure, to welcome first the students. Thanks to be here with us. Secondly, the teaching assistants who are in a nest up there. Bonjour. And finally, naturally, and mainly our speaker of tonight, Professor Geoff Gilbert from the University of Essex, who is coming especially to Geneva for this opportunity, for this event. I must say, you know the story, but you're the only one in the room, so I may repeat the story. It's a special, especially moving for me for one personal reason. I've been teaching extradition law for years at the Geneva Law School, and I gave to the students only one book in English, Aspects of Extradition Law, which changed its title in '96. By a professor, Geoff Gilbert, whom I didn't know, and I gave it to the students first because it was, in my view, frankly, the best book on extradition law, generally speaking, and secondly, to show them what the real English language is, because your generation is used to think, when they are not native English speakers like me, to think that they know English and they command English, and then they have to read real English legal literature, and then they discover it's a very complicated language. So every year, a student or two would come to me and say, I didn't understand really what this wonderful gentleman was saying about extradition. Can you help me, or can an assistant help me with some expressions which I'm not used to? That was my experience from the distance with Professor Gilbert. And then last June, we had a common event in Geneva with the University of Essex, where he's now teaching. And there was a gentleman in the room who said a lot of very interesting things about refugees and displaced persons. And it happened that it was the same person I have never met before. So I was very touched by the fact that after all these years, we finally meet in person. And then we had the idea of inviting him for this opening lecture. So it's also the opening event of the year. I have already welcomed the students 2 or 3 weeks ago, so I won't repeat all my words. Thanks to everybody. I already thanked the teaching assistant. Thanks to Danny and Catherine in absentia, who are managing the programs. Thanks to Camelia, also in absentia, I think, who's managing everything, including us. And finally, my presentation of Professor Gilbert. So Professor Gilbert is Professor of International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the School of Law and Human Rights Center of our partner, the University of Essex. The Academy has a very short series of privileged partners, and the first row of these partners is occupied by the University of Essex and by the University of Pretoria. You will, at least the students in Master of Transitional Justice, will meet with Professor Heinz later in the year. We have also partnerships with other universities, but these are our two main partners. So it's very important for us to nurture and to develop this partnership with Essex and with Pretoria, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to welcome Professor Gilbert tonight. He's the former editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Refugee Law. Professor Gilbert has been collaborating with the UNHCR in its work, both in Geneva and in the field, since 1995. In 2014-2015, with his co-researcher Anna Magdala Rusch, he undertook a 4-month consultancy involving field trips to Niger and Colombia, along with meetings in Geneva, New York, on the rule of law and its engagements for solutions. They produced a 18,000-word report. I haven't counted, but it's in the bio, for the UNHCR in early 2015, an article looking at the rule of law and UN interoperability will appear in the International Journal of Refugee Law sometime in 2018. Professor Gilbert is now undertaking 2 reports for UNHCR. That's why I thought that we could combine the events, this presence in Geneva for UNHCR and this opening lecture. 2 reports on exclusion and security and political participation of refugees in their country of nationality, the topic of tonight. This work is funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council. So it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Gilbert, thanking him to have done this trip to Geneva from London. I hope it was London City.
It was.
Ah, okay. So you have the floor, and thank you for being with us.
So, let's see if we can get this to... there's the mouse. Were there? Right. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I never knew my English was that good. I was editor-in-chief. Oh, sorry. I'm carrying this and forgetting who's not one of my greater moments. I think that, yeah, wow. Yeah, right. I was editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Refugee Law for 14 years. I gave up in 2015. And one of the joys of being the editor of the IJRL is that you get articles from all over the world, because refugees are all over the world. And we would publish in French, and we did publish a couple of articles in French, but by and large, everything comes in English. And shall I just say that English is one of those languages that's very, very easy to pick up and work with when you're writing a legal text. Oh, no. No. English makes Russian look simple because there are no rules, but there are lots of rules. The problem is that turned me basically into a copy editor for all these people from all over the world, and I was fixing that. And copy editors are just the most boring people on the planet. I mean, you never get invited to parties. I don't know why. I think we're really fun people out with whom to hang. Yeah. And there you've met English. Right. It's horrible. But tonight, as you probably noticed, I don't speak like the Queen. I come from the north of England. I come from Liverpool. I talk fast, and the more I talk, the faster I go. So, okay, I am going to talk fast because I want to get through this presentation quickly so that we can open up the floor for discussion. In the UK, we have things called WIPs, WIPs, okay, work in progress sessions, where someone has come along and they're very advanced with their project, but they want to test it out on an audience before they finish it. This is more of a work about to commence, because it was only last week that I got the proper terms of reference from UNHCR. So to use a sort of bit of English that we all know, this is more de labora ferenda. Work about to sort of get underway, and maybe, okay, the use of this evening for me is to see whether this outline works. I think I understand it. That doesn't mean you will. And that's what's worrying. I am actually going to stop trying to carry this because I've realised I've got to... Now, let's hope one of the... No, neither of these. Is someone up there going to... Oh, I think they already have. Well done, that person. Right. Okay. Right. So he says, okay, if we're talking about political participation of refugees and other displaced persons, both in their country of nationality, both in their country of nationality. I can't walk, right. Both in their country of nationality and in the host state, the first thing you're going to work out is who are we talking about and where are they? Because one of the problems with this area of law is those are very important questions, and international law has a bit of a problem. And the problem is that international law likes states. That's how it works. And it thinks that each state is basically an individual entity. And it works on that basis. But when we're talking about displaced persons, they may be across two states. And there may be political participation in more than one state. And UNHCR might have a memorandum of understanding with both states, and the two offices will be reporting to Geneva, okay, to try and get guidance. And let's say UNHCR Arcadia needs to talk to UNHCR Belgravia, but it might go either directly or it'll go via Geneva, and they're dealing with people who need to cross back between Arcadia and Belgravia in order to participate in elections. And suddenly international law goes, that my head hurts. Because we've got two governments, and that's before we get into the domestic law. I'm not even touching the domestic law. So, it's messy. It's unclear. There is law, but there's lots of law. And it doesn't necessarily fit together neatly. This is no nice jigsaw puzzle, okay? This is lots of bits which you might have bashed together so that it all works in the end. Bit, sort of, transitional justice. Yeah, sort of squeeze it. Oh, that's transitional justice. Right, there you are. So, who? Definitely refugees. What about IDPs? They're internally displaced persons. Stateless persons. UNHCR has a mandate for stateless persons as well. And then everyone. So, let's deal with refugees, start off with. 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, the 1967 protocol thereto provide that a refugee is someone who is outside their country of nationality with a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, political opinion, and they are unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of their country of nationality. That's a refugee. If you don't fit those criteria, you are not a refugee. Note the primary criterion. Outside country of nationality. Now think about voting. Get there in a minute. This is the beginning. We like mess, but you need to understand the mess. Mess is really good. How many people in the room are international lawyers? Raise your hand if you consider yourself to be an international lawyer. If not, leave the room now. Why are you here? Go out. There's nice bars. Go down to the lake. It's still beautiful. Right. International lawyers like mess. We like vague. It means that we can argue whatever we feel like and nobody can contradict us. That's how you want. You've got to stop thinking like students and start thinking like practitioners. Nobody wants you to be a student once you leave this degree. You've got to think like governments, and they are mean. So, okay, that's a refugee. No, it isn't. Because Article 1F comes along, and Article 1F is weird. How many people in the room have studied international human rights law at some point in the past? Right. Now, you know, and I know, that international law applies to everyone. Because you're a human being, you get human rights. Terrorists get human rights. There's no sort of saying, oh, you're not... Refugee law has an unworthiness clause. It is Article 1F. Article 1F lays down that if there are serious reasons for considering that you have committed a war crime, crime against humanity, crime against peace, serious non-political crime, or that you're guilty of acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations, you do not benefit from the Convention. You are excluded. So you might be outside with a well-founded fear, etc., 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 but if you've serious reasons for considering that, forget it. No protection. You are not a refugee. That comes back to bite us later. Patience. And then, Article 1C. The thing about refugee status is it's not asylum. I don't like the A word. It causes confusion. Brussels has a lot to answer for because it talks about asylum and immigration. It has a lot to answer for on that one. I talk about refugee status because refugee status is temporary. And what Article C is about is cessation. It's about that time coming when you no longer can claim that you are unable or unwilling to avail yourself of the protection of your country of nationality, and then your refugee status ends. Bye-bye, nice knowing you, go home, it's safe. Now, this wasn't, just to give you an example, this wasn't refugee status, this is the 1990s. Children came out of Bosnia. They were very, very young when they came out, and they went to Germany, and in Germany they were put in an orphanage. Their parents had been killed. They grew up in that German orphanage. They spoke German. The moment the ink was dry on the Dayton Agreement, those children went back to an orphanage outside Sarajevo. That's refugee status for you. Now, actually, they weren't refugees. Let's not go there. It's a lot more complicated than that. But that gives you the sort of the context. Refugee status is temporary. Come back to that. Then there are regional mechanisms. Go through these quickly. Africa, the Americas, Southeast Asia. What they did was they expanded the definition and said, just a minute, yeah, okay, we'll have all that stuff about outside well-founded fear, etc., but that's complicated. We're also going to protect anybody who comes out as a result of disturbance in their own countries for a variety of reasons. When I'm teaching this, I can spend 3 hours just on that and the distinctions between them. So let's not go there. But so if there is armed conflict, for instance, in your state, and you flee, you become a refugee. Now, that's not necessarily the case in the 51 Convention, because you've got to show persecution. And is an armed conflict a form of persecution? What if it's not for one of the 5 grounds? Now, your generation has grown up with non-international armed conflicts, where people are targeted because of their ethnicity or their religion or their politics. I grew up in a time of international armed conflicts, State A blowing the living daylights out of State B. And if you lived on the border, it was unfortunate. You just lived in the wrong place. There was no persecution going on. So that you weren't a refugee. No persecution, not a refugee. You were just living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Things have changed. Now take a look at guideline number 12 of UNHCR on interpreting the 51 Convention that came out in December 2016. By the way, please note, Professor of International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. There are some people who think humanitarian law is limited to the law of armed conflict. No, that's the law of armed conflict. Humanitarian law is much bigger, encompasses so much more, even transitional justice and refugees and displaced persons and everything. I have an advantage. I am old. Really old. And that means that I was around for a long time and I've been able to pick up lots and lots of law. It was also a lot less law when I was growing up. When I was growing up, you could have read every single decision of the European Court of Human Rights. And the dedicated had read every single decision of the European Commission as well. Nowadays, you can't keep up with what was decided last month. So it's harder for you. My sympathies, but tough. You want to work in this field. It's your decision. Right, IDPs. Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement came out in 1998. That's the description. It's not a definition, it's a description of who is an IDP. Note the bit in italics at the bottom. They are still in their country of nationality. So, think about this for a minute. We are talking about people who want to participate in the political process, and they're still in their country of nationality. How many people in the room are Swiss? Anybody in the room Swiss? Whoa, a few. So, if you come from the canton of Geneva, can you vote in the canton of Uri? Because internally displaced. Oh, there's a problem. I don't know the answer to that one. And that's the other problem we've got round here. Not only do I have to know the international law that applies to both states, what have they ratified, what have they not ratified, how many reservations and declarations did they put in, I've also got to know the domestic laws of each state. My head is beginning to hurt. I hope yours is too. Otherwise, I'm not doing my job properly. Stateless persons. Oh, right. 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons, that defines who a stateless person is. 1961 Convention on the reduction of statelessness. Statelessness is a cause of being a refugee. Most people who are stateless because of badly drafted nationality laws. Nobody went out of their way to make them stateless. Put the Rohingya to one side. That's deliberate. But there's a lot of people who are stateless around the world who, courtesy of decolonisation by the British, the French and everybody else who was into colonies, when the national laws were drafted at the end, certain groups didn't get included. And their children don't get included, and their grandchildren don't get included. So it's a mess. There are also people like the Rohingya who are deliberately persecuted as a consequence of which, and maybe, to my mind, they aren't stateless. They're just having the law badly applied to them. Okay, that's a different issue altogether. So you could be stateless and a refugee, but maybe you're not quite stateless. UNHCR quite rightly says, if you're treated as stateless by the state of which you should be a national, you're stateless, even if that's a bad interpretation of their own domestic law. And there are various ways to resolve that. One's to change the law, one's to apply it properly. Okay, but it's a mess. Stateless people in voting, difficult. And then everyone, oh drat, it didn't work. It works on my Mac. Okay, I did this on a Mac. That's the emoji, you know, the stroke your beard emoji, the 2 question marks. Geneva Academy. Move to a Mac. So much better. Right. Now, international human rights law applies to everyone. Now, in the case of Article 2.1 of the ICCPR, it's everyone, okay, within its territory and under its jurisdiction. I am using the ECHR. Now, this isn't me being Eurocentric. This is because there's actually case law under the European Convention on Human Rights Law I want to go back to later. And the rights set out in the ECHR are also found in the other regional conventions. So by analogy, we can sort of expand and extrapolate. But take a look at Article 1 of the ECHR. That applies to everyone within the jurisdiction. Okay. Where? Where are they? Refugees have to be outside. That's what it says, Article 1A2. You've got to be outside your country of nationality. Your butt. Returning refugees. Here I am. Whoops. Here I am. Put it back on again. Here I am. No, still not. But who cares? You can hear it at the back. Right. Here I am. I am a refugee. I set off over here from Arcadia. I am now in Belgravia. I am a refugee. I've been here 20 years. That, by the way, is the modal average time of a displacement situation, 20 years. That doesn't mean that people stay refugees for 20 years. That just means that most situations causing displacement, modal average time, 20 years. Been here for several years. I'm now going back because we're into a situation of transitional justice over here. We're moving back. I've returned to my country of nationality. That does not mean I stop being a refugee. So as not to cause massive... Is this one? Yeah, that one still is. We could get horrible feedback any second. Right. I've gone back. That doesn't stop me being a refugee. I am a returning refugee until I have re-established myself back in my country of nationality. I'm still a refugee and UNHCR still has a mandate for me. Come back to that in a minute. Mixed populations. So, you'll get refugees, returning nationals and their descendants and IDPs. Let me explain. I'm going back on this one. Yep, good. DIFA Niger. Right, as was pointed out in that very, very kind introduction. In 2014, with Anna Magdalena Ruch, we did a research project for UNHCR. One of the countries we went to was Niger, went to DIFA. Niger, by the way, for those who haven't been, is the poorest country on the planet according to UNDP's Humanitarian Index. DIFA is the poorest part of Niger. It's right next to Nigeria. We looked across the river at night and we could see Boko Haram looking back at us. 10 weeks after we were there, Boko Haram came across, but at that stage, Boko Haram hadn't left Nigeria. Then they started coming across. And they went into the market where we'd bought our eggs and they set off suicide bombs. So this DIFA's difficult. But DIFA was interesting, okay? Not only did you have Nigerians coming across, i.e. Nigerian nationals, you also had Nigerian, because Niger is poor, Nigeria is relatively rich. Lots of Nigerian had gone to Nigeria in search of work, maybe 2 or 3 generations ago. And now they came back because they were running away from Boko Haram too. Sensible move, by the way, running away from Boko Haram. Okay, and on top of that, you had people from Cameroon and a few others, and you had internally displaced people. So some people were so close to the border, they had to move away. So you had IDPs within Niger as well. So you had returning Nigerian, you had refugees, and you had IDPs all together. And because UNHCR was out there with the World Food Programme, but they didn't have a camp at that stage. What was happening was that the local people were letting all these displaced persons build their own shelters on the side of their houses. UNHCR was providing materials, World Food Programme providing food. Poorest country on the planet, people welcoming in. Chef de village would remember some of the people say, yeah, you're Nigerian. Children going into the local schools, everything done like that. The next time anybody says Europe is being swamped by refugees, feel free to kick them. The poorest country on the planet welcomed anybody who came across the river. We get worried when a few thousand show up. Sorry, party political broadcast over on behalf of the human being. Right. Citizens vote, but that could be returning nationals, it could be IDPs, and what about refugees who are integrated, who are given nationality within the country? After 30 years, Tanzania has just given nationality to a whole load of Burundians who've been there 30 years. Okay? But those Burundians now vote in Tanzania. Score. Well done, Tanzania. Actors. States, at least 2 of them. We've already pointed out the problems with that. What have they ratified? What haven't they ratified? Okay? All this stuff. And then you get international organisations. Oh my word, life just became difficult. Because we're not talking individuals and we're not talking states, who are the usual international law players. We've got international organisations, and they're a mess. They don't fit. They're horrible. UNHCR, it's a lovely horrible, but it's a horrible. Right. Its 1950 statute sets out in paragraph 2 that its work is to be entirely non-political. What does that mean in this context? Paragraph 8c, though, says it's to assist governments to promote voluntary repatriation. So here I am. I'm over here in Belgravia. Belgravia is poor. It wants these refugees to go back. UNHCR has a mandate to promote voluntary repatriation. Hey, just a minute. I'm a refugee. I don't want to go back. There's no elections. There's no nothing. We get no say in the government. They persecute me. Have you not heard what's gone on in the Security Council? The Security Council has talked to the government back there. You are now going to be able to go back and participate, and there's unicorns and purple fairy dust as well. You're promoting voluntary repatriation by voting, by political participation. The unicorns and the purple fairy dust, that's for the future. Right. Respect, protect, fulfill. Fulfill comes later. What about, does international human rights law apply to international organisations? They don't ratify treaties. And what about rule of law in the UN? In 2004 and in 2012, the UN said rule of law was one of the basic principles of the United Nations. Now, different parts of the UN interpret rule of law in different ways. That just makes life difficult. That's why Anna and I have written the article that's coming out next year. Rule of law and UN interoperability. Okay. What UNDP thinks, we'll get to them in a minute. Okay. By the way, if you take a look at the guiding principles on internal displacement, which I referred to before, take a look at paragraph 3D of the introduction. Paragraph 3D says, these guiding principles apply to international organisations like UNHCR. How? Because 3 academics, one of whom was Swiss, Walter Kalin, said, oh yeah, it applies. Yeah, really, honestly, yeah, honest gov. I love academics. Yeah, it applies to IOs too. How? Just because your professor tells you this, don't believe it. Check for yourself. Think. UN, what about UNDP? Right, if you want to do political participation, United Nations Development Programme, Department of Political Affairs, they're the ones with the mandate for it. Now, there's a small problem with these two. Okay. They get nosebleeds if they leave the capital city. UNH, some of them, look, they hyperventilate if they have to leave New York. But think of Colombia. UNDP has a little bit of a presence in about 3 cities. UNHCR is everywhere. How do you do political participation unless you're everywhere? Making certain it works. Trying to resettle returning populations. UNDP talks to governments. That's its job. But they're the ones with the political participation mandate, so, messy. That's why we like rule of law. Because everybody has to interoperate. Right. Now we have a special rapporteur on transitional justice, Pablo de Greff. Okay, read his stuff. He is cosmically wonderful. He's also from South America, which means that he's willing to expand legal ideas in a way that boring European positivists find a little bit strange. But we go, yeah, I'll buy some of that because it's useful. Okay, transitional justice, the ability to say what you like. Okay, because no one can prove you wrong. By the way, although I am currently working with UNHCR, everything I say tonight is in my academic capacity. Do not think that UNHCR has had anything to do with what I am saying tonight. Okay, they haven't. Okay, I'm testing this out before I show it to them. Okay, they would, some of this stuff, no. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, basically what tonight is about is academic freedom. And as a colleague of mine, Philip Allett, once put it, academic freedom is the right to say what you like because nobody's listening. Right. Right, rights and political participation. So let's take a look. Oh, let's do that quicker. Otherwise you're going to get headaches. You can see I got bored. Right. The 1951 Convention. Look at the starting point. Refugees lawfully staying in the territory. That's not just every refugee. That's refugees lawfully staying in the territory. So they've had some things happened to make them that. In the territory of the host state, enjoy the most favourable treatment accorded to foreigners as regards non-political and non-profit-making associations and joining trade unions. So that's a pretty limited. That's the 51 Convention on political participation. But take a look at Article 2. Every refugee has duties to the country in which he finds himself, which require in particular that he conforms to its laws and regulations, as well as measures taken for the maintenance of public order. Imagine you are refugees in a refugee camp. Imagine there's mixed groups there. This is a messy, I mean, lots of people have fled South Sudan and gone into Kenya. They don't all believe the same thing. They don't all have the same political outlook. Imagine political participation in Kakuma, refugee camp in Kenya. That's going to be tricky. Think about maintenance of public order. Think about what the domestic law is about participating in the politics of another country. Yeah. The preamble to the 51 Convention, though, does refer to the UDHR. What's the status of a preamble when you're trying to interpret the convention? Wait till later in the year if you haven't done international law. Yes, but you need to know that sort of thing. How do I read the preamble? The preamble refers to the UDHR. The UDHR talks about freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. The preamble to the convention refers to this. How do I read that into my understanding of the 51 Convention? And remember, 15 is about participation in the politics of the country where you're living. What about, it doesn't say anything about country of nationality. I like vague. I love vague. I love messy. I am the kid who made mud pies. The 1969 Convention muddies the waters even further. That's the African Convention, which says in Article 3, okay, as a refugee, you should not engage in subversive activities. What does that mean? You shall not do anything to undermine any other state within the African Union. How does that work in this context? But keep on going. International Covenant of Civil Political Rights. Article 25. I'm going to stand over here for a second. Right, I'm bored. I need to move. Right. You think of the ICCPR. You'll go, oh yes, it applies to everyone within the territory and jurisdiction. Is the and copulative or disjunctive? Interesting question. Ask the Americans and the Israelis, then ask the rest of the world. Okay? If you don't understand that, you will later. Okay? But not Article 25. Article 25 applies to citizens. Political participation, but for citizens. Except, and this is where you have to get really clever and remember everything all the time, which is what's difficult in life. Refugees are refugees. They don't lose their citizenship of the country of nationality. That's why stateless refugees are a little more complicated. But just because you are a refugee from Arcadia in Belgravia doesn't stop you being Arcadian. You just are not prepared to avail yourself of the protection of your country of nationality. You are unable or unwilling. But you don't lose your nationality, which means you're a citizen of Arcadia for the purpose of Article 25. Oh dear, we'll come back to that later. How do you make that work or not work? Articles 19 to 21, freedom of expression, association, assembly, that applies to refugees. They're on the territory. Article 27, right of persons belonging to a minority. Now, refugees are being persecuted. That's part of the definition. One of the reasons they could be being persecuted, they're a minority in their country of nationality. In those states in which minorities exist. That's how Article 27 starts. Now, traditionally, the view is that to be a person belonging to a minority, you've got to be a national of the state in which you find yourself. So the host country would say, yeah, but they're not our nationals, we don't have to worry about them. Article 27 can't apply to them, they can't be refugees. Except General Comment 2350 of the Human Rights Committee said, where do you get that from? It doesn't say anywhere in Article 27 they have to be nationals. So here we have a real problem. I was in Kosovo in 2001 when UNMIK was running Kosovo, United Nations Mission in Kosovo. And at that same moment, Macedonia started having a problem with its own Albanian ethnic population. And there was unrest, disruption. Won't say it was a non-international armed conflict, but it was definitely civil disturbance. And a whole load of Macedonian Albanians tried to come into Kosovo. And in the space of 15 minutes sitting in an office in Pristina, we drafted a 10-point plan for UNMIK police as to how they should treat these Macedonians trying to come in. Because, let's face it, Kosovo was in 2001, Kosovo was still a bit of a novelty. Okay, we didn't quite know what was going on. I'd been there in July 2000. At that point, nobody knew anything. We had no idea. I was back there March 2001 when this blew up. That is part of the issue. When minorities flee, they tend to flee to countries where they know there are other members of their people. This is why, to a certain extent, the Rohingya have gone to Bangladesh. One, Rakhine state is next door to Bangladesh, but two, there was cross-border movement. You take a look at Niger. In the southeast, the people who've come from Nigeria all speak the same language as the people in the southeast of Niger. Likewise, there are a whole load of Malian nomads who've come across the border because they've always come across that border into northern Niger, and they're mixing with the northern Nigerian. Yeah, this happens. Article 27. Bit messy. Another bit to throw into the pot. And then you got Article 1, self-determination. And the true international lawyers are about to go, you can't talk about Article 1. That's just getting silly. Article 1 is a right of peoples. It's not a right of individuals. That's the starting point. The Human Rights Committee will not entertain a case on Article 1. Okay? But in a case called Aparana Pahuika and New Zealand, there it is, the Human Rights Committee said that in interpreting Article 27, you can use Article 1's concept of self-determination to understand what enjoying your own culture means in Article 27. Oh dear. If you get that, you're doing really well. ECHR, European Convention on Human Rights. Please note, you can find the same in the African Convention and African Charter on Human and People's Rights as in the American Convention on Human Rights. So Article 10, freedom of expression. Take a look at TBKP and Turkey. That's all about political participation. The right of the Turkish Communist Party to participate, not to get kicked out of Parliament because it supported the Kurds. Article 14, non-discrimination. It can include based on national origin. So you can't discriminate on grounds of national origin. Refugees are not of the same national origin. You can't discriminate against refugees. Begin to understand how you've got to know everything. Isn't it fun? Right. Protocol 1, Article 3 allows for the free expression of the people. But is that just an obligation for Council of Europe member states? Or does it extend to refugees from outside Europe and free expression of the people? I'm coming to this in a minute. You're going to go, my head hurts so much more in a minute. I'm doing the easy stuff at the minute. And then Article 53. How many people knew there was an Article 53 in the ECHR? How many people thought, no. Yeah, it's a bit like refugee lawyers. You ask a refugee lawyer, sort of, what's the last article in the Refugee Convention? They'll go, Article 33. Yeah, no. Refugee lawyers can't count, by the way. They go 1, 31, 33. They don't know any other articles. Any refugee lawyer in the room? Yeah, it's true. But Article 53. Article 53 is interesting. By the way, for those who are really dedicated, it's Article 29B of the American Convention and Article 60 and 61 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So same article, same ideas are found in all three regional mechanisms. And what Article 53 says is, nothing in the ECHR shall be construed as limiting rights and any other rights that the High Contracting Party has, which in this case would be Article 1 of the ICCPR. There is no equivalent to Article 1 of the ICCPR in the European Convention on Human Rights. But what you cannot do is limit, okay, the enjoyment of the rights that a state that is party to both the ECHR and the ICCPR through the ECHR. Article 53 says, so, in a case called KPD in the Federal Republic of Germany, the European Commission on Human Rights in 1957 says, yes, you can close down the Communist Party of Germany because it's a threat to the values of the ECHR. That's what it basically says. The corollary of that is, if you're a political party and you're not a threat to the values of the ECHR, the government can... Now you begin to see where self-determination, freedom of expression, non-discrimination, all start gelling. Now, I'm not certain how stable my mud pie is at the minute. I've got to find a lot more authority, and I hope maybe some of you know some. Okay, that's my hope. Okay, but you begin to see how you can start thinking, and as long as you know, I know my refugee law, I know my human rights law, I know a bit of transitional justice. I know how international organisations fit into the international sphere. How can I get all this to come together to facilitate the political participation of refugees? I do not know. However, it's not that simple. That's the easy stuff. You finished the easy stuff. So, UNHCR's mandate. We're getting near the end, by the way, for those who are falling asleep. Paragraph 2, you've got to be entirely non-political as UNHCR. Okay? How does that work? Well, here's a thought. UNHCR cannot be political, but if it's helping everybody participate in the political activity, is that political? Or is that simply facilitating voluntary repatriation? Choosing sides, what they cannot be is say, okay, we favour that party, therefore we'll bus back those refugees but not these refugees. That would be wrong. But it's a bit like the ICRC having this idea of neutrality and then speaking out against violations, no matter who does them. That's not violating their principle of neutrality, where they condemn a party to a conflict for violating international human rights law. Being non-political does not mean you cannot engage in anything that is remotely connected to politics. Being non-political means that you don't choose sides. International protection of refugees, even after the refugees return to the country of nationality, UNHCR still has this mandate. So, just a minute. Here I am. I am in Arcadia. This is 20 years ago. Bang, boom, run away. Hello, Belgravia. So, there will be a UNHCR presence in Arcadia. There is a separate UNHCR presence in Belgravia. There will be 2 memoranda of understanding with the 2 states. UNHCR Geneva, just across the road, of a negotiated memoranda of understanding with both states. This crowd have a different MOU to that crowd. Now, whether they can talk to each other directly or whether they have to go because they're all umbilically attached to Geneva, okay, who knows? But the refugees want to start going back. Here is the border. UNHCR Belgravia could wave goodbye to them here, might have permission to come in, but definitely will not just sort of leave them and say, okay, you know you're way home now. UNHCR Arcadia will be here waiting for them. If the UNHCR Belgravia, now UNHCR has on occasions moved people around. They have taken people back temporarily. UNHCR Ecuador, for instance, takes people back into Colombia because there are Colombian refugees in Ecuador. That's how it works. And you don't stop being a refugee. Or do you? That's the question I was asking before. If UNHCR is not in a position to facilitate the participation by every refugee, should it withdraw and not facilitate any refugees' political participation? Would that be a violation of it being non-political? Cessation. Article 1C, refugee status can end if the refugees voluntarily re-avail themselves and establish themselves. Is political participation cessation? Is the moment you start participating an example of cessation? What about going back to vote? UNHCR buses you back to a place where you can vote. Can you have polling booths, voting places to vote, in a refugee camp across the border? What's the law in the state what's the law in Belgravia on that? Will Belgravia allow Arcadian politicians to come here to talk to the refugees? Please note that in the summer, Germany and Austria both banned Erdogan's party from Turkey coming in and talking to the population. So you begin to see how this is messy. We've got domestic law coming in there. Not enough to know all the international law. You've got to know the domestic law as well. You've got to know everything, all the time. And then realise you still don't know everything. Just to give you something, this is how it works in practice. So, with regard to the Malians in Niger, there's a tripartite agreement. With regard to the Myanmar Burmese in Thailand, UNHCR tripartite agreement to allow them to participate, to start facilitating the process for return. And participation, it's more than voting. Okay? Don't know about you, but I registered back in the UK based on where I live. So I registered to vote in Colchester, which is where the University of Essex is based. Can you register when you're in a refugee camp? What if you can't go back to the bit where you came from because somebody else is now living there? That happened a lot in Bosnia. Okay? That's problematic. Okay? How do you deal with that? And then Altos de Florida in Colombia. Any Colombians in the room? Hello. Hello. Right. Bit of Colombia for you. Okay. That's Anna and me in 2014 in Altos de Florida. Anna's now working for UNHCR. And Altos de Florida is in the municipality of Soacha. Okay, which is the municipality right next door to Bogota. If we were looking down the mountain, Altos de Florida, logically it's a mountain, okay, and we can actually see Bogota, and we can see the president's sort of accommodation in Bogota from where we're standing. We might as well have been on the moon, okay. Altos de Florida, that is basically the top of a mountain where nobody was living. And the IDPs went to the top of the mountain because nobody was living there and nobody could tell them you can't live here. And they built this place. No running water, no electricity, only mud roads. Okay. But you got a load of people living there. And UNHCR facilitated the building of a school. There we're actually standing in the grounds of the school. Okay, and the reason they did that is so that the kids didn't have to go all the way down the mountain to the schools in other parts of Soacha, because on the way they could get abused, exploited, and all sorts of stuff. So you built a school to protect them. UNHCR's mandate, protection. Build a school, you protect the kids. Clever. Okay, so we're actually standing in the school. Where do you vote? We met the adults who lived in... We met the kids and then we met the adults in Altos de Florida. Some of them had been on the move for nigh on 30 years. They hadn't just been displaced once in Colombia, they'd been displaced 3 or 4 times. They had grandchildren. We're not just talking about children of displaced people, we're talking grandchildren during displacement. The people we were talking to, they possibly came from a rural village somewhere in central Colombia. Their children and their grandchildren may only have known living on the outskirts of big cities where the main IDP populations have congregated. Where do you vote? Where is home? What do you know of rural Colombia if you're 11 and all you've known is living on the top of this mountain, looking down on the president's palace. So forget the law for a minute. The actual implementation, the logistics of actually achieving what you want to achieve. You could really affect sort of who gets elected in particular parts of the country because people have been moved around. You can facilitate ethnic cleansing and set it in concrete simply by saying where people shall vote. Do not get me onto the constitution drawn up as a consequence of Dayton. We didn't get into those cases of the ECHR, but basically the European Court of Human Rights has turned around to Bosnia and said, your constitution is a violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. You've got to change your constitution. Thank you, the international community. You gave it to them. Last slide. Participation. Voting from overseas. Is it permitted? That's a question of domestic law. Okay. Can you vote while you're overseas? So if you're a refugee over there, can you vote back here? I can vote wherever I am in the world in a UK election as long as I set it up properly. Can I do that from a refugee camp? Can UNHCR bus them across the border? Only if we can bus all of them. What about campaigning? We've seen this, but can you stand for election from overseas? Could a refugee from Colombia currently resident in Ecuador stand for election? Participation via the internet, Facebook. Participation isn't just voting. It isn't just standing for election. It's actually being able to campaign and to write stuff. And that was clever. Someone had turned this off before it dropped on the ground. That would have been a bang. Right. Last week, Facebook closed down pages being put out by Rohingya because they didn't want to annoy various countries. They closed down Rohingya writing about what was happening to them. Thank you, Facebook. Go close your account tonight. And there's the role of UNDP, DPA, alongside UNHCR. In Colombia, UNHCR and UNDP have what's known as a Transitional Solutions Initiative, a TSI, where they work together in order. Because the UNHCR is everywhere and UNDP likes capital cities, or big cities at least. And then there's the rule of law, which is a principle of the United Nations and which calls for democratization and participation. Take a look at what the Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice has said about all this. And then my final question, excludees. This is it, finishing, just a minute, what time is it? Oh, a bit later than I thought. I'd probably back now. I'd have been quicker if I remembered this episode. Right. I'm going to use Colombia as an example. Okay, simply because it's easier for everybody to understand, rather than Arcadia and Belgravia. I was someone who was a member of FARC. I fled Colombia and I've ended up in Spain. Let's just say that some things I did mean that I have been excluded under Article 1F. Maybe not me personally, but maybe the group I was with. Maybe I tried to get out as soon as I could, but I've been excluded. UNHCR has no mandate for me. Paragraph 7D of the statute says UNHCR cannot provide any protection mandate to excluded persons. So who's going to help me participate? Because let's face it, if I was still in Colombia and I was a high-up member of FARC, I'd have been in Havana participating. But because I'm in Madrid, who's going to facilitate my participation? Because UNHCR can't. And now I'm going to throw at you the horrible question. The last one, the bit I don't understand. Take a look at the European Convention on Human Rights. That's the other reason I've used Colombia. Article 1 says that the rights set out in the Convention are there for everyone under the jurisdiction of the Council of Europe member state. Spain is a member of the Council of Europe. It's ratified the European Convention on Human Rights. It's got to facilitate the rights of everyone. Now, everybody agrees that the optimal solution to displacement crises is voluntary repatriation. Unfortunately, it's not possible in every case, but it is the optimal solution. Is Spain's obligation to facilitate my participation so that I can voluntarily repatriate to a country in transitional justice? Does Spain have to facilitate my rights under the ECHR vis-à-vis Colombia? Because this is all about UNHCR. But UNHCR doesn't do political participation on its own. States have obligations too. Obligations under the 51 Convention, obligations under international human rights law. Then there's other bits of the UN. And really, it's all this stuff. Rule of law, which we really like as international lawyers because it means whatever we feel like. If I ask every lawyer in the room what rule of law means, they will come up with that many definitions plus one. And of course, if I'm an Anglophone, I talk about rule of law. Okay? L'état de droit, Rechtsstaat. Okay? And they're different concepts of rule of law. And the UN says, oh yeah, we like rule of law. And then you look at the translations and they have all the different variations on a theme. Estado de Derecho? I can't do Spanish. Spanish is not what?
Principio de legalidad.
I've seen it in the UN thing as the equivalent of l'état de droit in French. Estado de Derecho. You begin. Duh. I got off a plane now about 2 hours ago. Give me a break. Right. It's a mess. That's it. That's the end. Don't think there are answers. If there are answers, we'd all be unemployed. They could give it to a computer. Feed the stuff in, it will come out with answers. We don't want answers. How many people in the room have got a law degree? Right. So you're going to make money out of being able to argue against somebody else. So your client wants to make an argument against somebody else. That other person's probably going to have a lawyer too. And that other lawyer's telling me, oh, you can win. And you're saying, oh, you're going to win. We don't want answers. We want mess. The problem with a law degree is it trains you to be a judge. What a master should teach you how to do is to think like a practitioner, but a practitioner who sees all the arguments so that you can represent any client. One of my colleagues, Françoise Hampson, taught the European Convention on Human Rights for years. And at the end, she gave you the exam. It was always a problem question based on a problem within a state. And you went along and you took out a bit of paper, and the bit of paper said whether you were representing the applicant or the government. And your exam paper, therefore, had to be written either for the applicant or for the government. She always drafted it so you could write it for both. That's how you've got to think. Are you working for UNHCR? Are you working for the government? Are you working for an NGO protecting refugees? It's a mess. Your turn. No. This is what I do for a living and you're helping me. Okay. Can I ask you a question? Do you feel as though you are more confused now than when you entered? Good, I've got it right. Okay. Do you feel that you understand the parameters better than you did? Yeah, right, good. Then on that basis, it's working. It's not the finished product by any stretch. I was talking before, and we were talking about legal positivists, and I'm a legal positivist. And the problem with legal positivists is they like to get on the train and get from A to B. Not really that much use. Because law is never like that if it was boring. You've got to be able to describe the scenery that you see as you go along on the train journey. And you've got to choose which bits of the scenery are the important bits. That's how you have got to think when you're trying to do international law, whether it's international humanitarian law, international human rights law, whatever, transitional justice. It's about knowing the train track, knowing the law bit, and then being able to describe the relevant bits that you see out of the window. Because nobody wants to know everything that you can see out of the window. Oh, another tree. Oh, there's another tree. Yeah. But that's an interesting tree. That tree matters. That tree doesn't. That's how you make certain you keep within word limits. Right, questions? Come on, your turn. Go for it.
I need to stand up or no? Yeah. Thank you for your lecture, and I just have some reflections on the issues regarding to stateless persons. I'm from China, and the most significant stateless issues are about Vietnam women in China. There are some women from Vietnam. They come to China through illegal means, either by human trafficking or someone from China who promised them that they will help them to find a husband in China, and they come to China and marry some man and living in a village. So if they have children with the Chinese man, there's not a problem because the father is Chinese, so the children would have Chinese citizenship. But the problem is that if there is a child who come to Vietnam with this Vietnam woman, which means that the child's father is not Chinese, and when they live in China, it's hard for the child to have a Chinese citizenship because we only grant citizenship to the foreigners who married Chinese or who have Chinese parents. And according to the public security department, they says that if the woman and the child who left Vietnam to China, and the Vietnam government would cancel their citizenship in Vietnam. So it's hard for the child who are come to China with their mother to get the document or to get access to education. So you've just mentioned that this is stateless is an issue for like nationality law, but I think that to some degree there is a need for international cooperation. So I wonder, what do you think about this gap between different policies in different countries, and are there any international practice regarding to this issue? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to deal with that one because it's statelessness, and statelessness is peculiar. Okay, the starting point for that one is definition of statelessness 54 Convention, Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness 61 Convention. So what states cannot do if they've ratified the 61 Convention is engage in any practice that means that somebody loses their nationality. Now, I happen to know this because one of my graduates is basically the person responsible for statelessness for UNHCR for the whole of Southeast Asia, and Vietnam is one of his countries. Okay, and Vietnam does have this policy that if you leave Vietnam and you don't keep registering with the Vietnamese embassy in the relevant country, you lose your nationality after so many years. So this is problematic. Equally, I was going to ask a question. You know this Vietnamese woman, what if she doesn't marry the Chinese man and has a child? Is the child still Chinese? So they're not married when the child is born. Is the child still Chinese with a Chinese father, but not without marriage?
Oh, but the child is but if the child's father is a Chinese man, then the child would be Chinese.
Right, as long as they're prepared to, as long as the father is prepared to recognise the child.
Yes, they have a DNA test.
Oh, right.
It doesn't matter if you get the certificate of the marriage.
Okay. That's good. No, because in the past that wasn't the case in Japan, for instance. Japan, if you weren't married, would not give nationality to the child born of what was usually in those cases a Filipino woman in Japan, okay, to a Japanese father, even with DNA and all the rest of it. That's now changed. So you begin to see all of this is just another country's laws. So you've got to ask each country about what its laws are on this. And the answer is, yes, you do need international cooperation. UNHCR has the mandate for dealing with stateless persons. It's currently got a campaign on. It started in 2014, the I Belong campaign. It was started by Mark Manley, who is now UNHCR's rep to Mexico, and Mark is an Essex graduate. And Mark started the I Belong campaign. Just look it up. Hashtag I Belong, all one word. Okay, and that's the program to get states to reduce statelessness so that by 2024 there will be no stateless persons left. It requires, though, domestic laws. Lots and lots of domestic laws to be changed. And in the case of the children who are of a Vietnamese woman who goes... I mean, so much of statelessness law is bad because there's discrimination against women. Okay? Women cannot pass on nationality in so many nationality laws. That's just stupid. Who do you think gave birth? But yeah, so it's down to domestic laws and international obligations and UNHCR's mandate. Is there an answer to your particular question? No. Other than keep on campaigning. We've got about 7 years left till 2024. And we're going to get rid of everybody by then. More questions, please. Someone is rushing towards you.
Thank you. Faisal from Bangladesh. So recently the problem we have is about the Rohingya problem. And the problem is that before 6 or 7 years, our government used to say that, okay, we are not party to 51 convention, so you are not allowed to come. But right now they're allowing, means that there are inconsistency about their attitudes. The problem is that we have I think the maximum of the Rohingya population are in Bangladesh. But what would be their rights as we haven't ratified the convention? And second point is about statelessness. So I don't think that it's all about the national law because we have a significant number of stated people, Bihari. And in 2008, High Court Division judgment says that, okay, you can have the Bangladeshi citizenship. But the fact is that not all people accepted that. They still think that we can go back to Pakistan one day. So I don't think that it's all about the domestic law. Thank you.
Right. Yes, I think. Right. Good. First of all, we should all be grateful to Bangladesh for opening its borders and leaving those borders open. Take a look at Europe with regard to borders and leaving them open. Bangladesh, incredibly poor country, has just said, yeah, they've got to come here because there's nowhere else to go. But, right, just because a state has not ratified the 51 Convention does not mean that the people who come across the border are not refugees. The international community has given UNHCR a mandate to provide international protection to all refugees. And UNHCR has a definition of who is a refugee. It's laid down in paragraph 6 and 7 of its statute. So if UNHCR says these people are refugees, they are refugees. Now that brings us then to the obligations of Bangladesh towards these people. Clearly, it has not ratified the 1951 Convention. So there is no process in place for Bangladesh to sort of grant them refugee status in Bangladesh. That doesn't mean that there's no obligations on Bangladesh. Customary international law kicks in. One of the obligations that everybody recognises as part of customary international law is non-refoulement. The obligation not to send people back to the frontiers of a territory where their life or freedom would be threatened. So, despite the fact that Bangladesh has not ratified the 51 Convention, it still cannot send back the Rohingya to Myanmar. Regardless. I mean, then what we'd have to do, and sorry, I haven't checked in advance, but if I was working in this area, that's what I would do. I would now go back, I'd go online and I would check every single convention that Bangladesh has ratified, and I would check every single reservation and declaration that they put in place. I would do a proper sort of country assessment and then say, right, you might not have ratified 51, but you have ratified this, this, and this, and as a consequence you have these obligations because these people are on your territory, and international human rights law kicks in. As for the law and what is the law, like me, you come from a common law country, okay? So we are used to courts telling us what the law is, okay? In some countries around the world, judges don't have quite the same authority, okay? So, again, it's one of those things we'd have to look at. So I will look at this decision of the Bangladesh High Court, Supreme Court of Bangladesh, and I would read it and that would tell me, yes, this is how I am now meant to interpret Bangladeshi constitution, Bangladeshi nationality law, so that I can see whether right. I can draft a law tomorrow. Implementing it at the domestic level is a very different question. How many people in the room are international relations scholars or political scientists, as opposed to lawyers? Yeah, don't worry, we like you. Okay. We think you're a bit weird, but we like you. It's all well and good to have laws. It's all well and good to have court decisions. Implementing them at the domestic level. How many people drive a car? How many people always obey the speed limit? Always. Okay, right. So now you see the problem with law, okay? In the case of nationality law, it's a bit different from speeding laws, okay? But yeah, it's that question. It's now about educating the population and saying, look, the law has changed. We might have thought it meant this. The court has now said it means this. This is what's got to happen. That doesn't mean that there are certain people in Bangladesh who would not one day want to go back to Pakistan. Okay? They've got the right to do that. But everybody who wants to stay in Bangladesh post this Supreme Court decision now has the right to, based on the decision of the Supreme Court. Getting that into the mindset of Bangladeshi population and society, different issue. Okay? And my job stops at getting the law right. Implementing it, I'll come up with some policies, but hey, I'll leave that to the political scientists because they know what they're doing. and I don't. I'm a lawyer. I'm a really boring, positivist lawyer. Honest. Next question, please. Oh, we've got a fight on our hands, two of them.
Good evening, Diko Moranson from Cameroon. I wish to know the fine line that exists between being a refugee and being stateless, and how maybe a practical situation where a person can become a refugee as a matter of fact or as a matter of law. Thank you.
Okay. They're very different things. And you can be both, which is just confusing. To be a refugee, you've got to, in the eyes of a state, you've got to fall within the 1951 Convention. For the international community, UNHCR can say you're a refugee based on its approach. So that decides who is a refugee. To be a refugee, you've got to be outside your country of nationality. So if you're Cameroonian, you've got to be outside of Cameroon. And currently you are. So step one, you've satisfied the first requirement. Now you're all laughing. This is actually important. Being a refugee is not about why you left. It's about why you can't go back. So just because you've come here as students doesn't mean you, the number of my students who've turned into refugees while I've been in the country, because we once held a conference for government officials. Okay, we were training British Commonwealth government officials from small states. And while we were holding this conference on democracy and human rights, there was a coup back in one of the countries and the person could no longer go back. So they come to learn about democracy and there's a coup goes on while they're out the country. Boy, did we look stupid. That's about 30 years ago almost. Doesn't matter why you left, it's all about why you can't go back. And if you can't go back because you've got a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and you're unwilling or unable to avail yourself of the protection of your country of nationality, you are a refugee. Full stop. That's the definition. Now, the problem is that there's also statelessness. Now, statelessness is different. I mean, if you really wanted to get into this, you can, because really interestingly, when they first started negotiating the 1951 Convention, it was going to deal with both refugees and stateless people in one convention. And then round about 1949-50, they said, no, we need to set refugees we can decide on now, stateless are going to wait. And that's why the Stateless Convention is 54. Okay, and they separated them. But up until then, the stateless and refugee walked hand in hand. But since then, no. Stateless means that you do not have a nationality of any country. Okay, that's basically the 54 Convention's definition. You don't have the nationality of any country. Why don't you have the nationality of any country? Well, that's probably because of the nationality laws, which say you don't get it. Now, in most countries, children get it because they're born in that country. But some countries don't do that. Particularly if the way the parent arrived was non-regulated. So in other words, they didn't immigrate with the appropriate documentation, like refugees. So you get to see the problem there. That's stateless. Just to make life confusing, obviously, if you're a stateless person already and you have to flee persecution, You go to another country and they say, oh, you've got to be outside your country of nationality. You don't have a country of nationality. Therefore, there is a separate part of the 51 Convention, which I didn't go, because there was only so many hours in the day. You can also be a refugee if you're outside, if you're stateless and you're outside your country of habitual residence. Okay, that's Article 1A2 as well. But I didn't deal with that because that's just way too complicated for an evening lecture. But yeah, that's the, there you go. Start with the 51 Convention, look at the 54 Convention, then look at UNHCR's statute. Problem solved. Or at least, you'll at least know what your problems are, which is halfway to solving problems. There was another question down there. Oh, there's two now. They can fight over the mic. Go for it.
Hello, I'm Anna from Zimbabwe. My question is with some of the situation that happened in Zimbabwe. For a long time before the economic and political arena got really, really bad, Zimbabwe was a safe destination. And there was no conflict, and there has not been since post-colonial. So most refugees came in. But what transpired was in the Great Lake regions, I'm not familiar, so I might explain. You had situations like, for example, in Rwanda, some of the people who participated in the genocide atrocities fled to DRC. And then, of course, there was also fighting with rebels in Uganda and elsewhere. Now, when they fled, the question is, they then didn't cease the actions they were doing, so there's been fighting back and forth, and that's in violation of an article in the African Charter that says subversive acts against a member of the AU. And then what happened is some people who were caught in between this fighting started trekking down to Southern Africa. Some Mozambique, some ended up in Zimbabwe, and we have one of the biggest refugee camps in Southern Africa. But what happened, some of the adults who were traveling with the children, they got lost, or they got killed along the way, or some were arrested as they were crossing those states. So as they then landed in Zimbabwe, or ended up in Zimbabwe, you ended up with children who had no idea who they were. And today they don't know who they were. And some of them were maybe results of people who, they were born along the way and they arrived as minors, and someone said, I just carried them. No one can identify that person. And we are talking about conflicts that happens maybe 3 decades ago, and you still can't identify that person, and now as an adult, they don't even know who they are. What happens in such a scenario? Thank you.
Thanks. Right. Okay. So, interesting side note while I think. There is actually a bus that goes direct from Kinshasa to Johannesburg with only one stop en route. And it's basically a refugee bus. Basically, you're getting out of DRC, you're going to South Africa, to Johannesburg, and it only stops once, whereas most buses in Africa are doing that sort of, if ever you've done the sort of the trek around Africa, you know the bus will go from one city to the next city to the next city. No, this is a bus that goes from Kinshasa to Johannesburg with just one stop. Okay, that's a refugee bus. Okay, its only reason to exist is to move refugees quickly. It's the express refugee bus, like the 5X, which takes you to the airport. Okay, so I've thought. Clearly this is a nationality question. Okay, do we give them Zimbabwean nationality? Now, if a child is born on the territory, the logical test within common law systems, and Zimbabwe is common law, okay, is that you get the nationality of that country. Now what you've got here though is, I have no idea where they were born. And if you're on the move like that, it's not as though you went along and got the birth registered. Oh yeah, we were just passing through this and some nice person gave me a stamp saying I was born here. That doesn't happen. One of the problems when Anna and I were in DIFA was, okay, refugees had no documentation, nor did 60% of the Nigerian population in that region. How could you prove who you were with no documentation? This is why UNHCR with UNDP and the World Bank is doing biometric registration for the whole of Niger. So, in answer to your question, there is no answer to your question. It will all depend on Zimbabwe. The first thing that should happen is that you try and locate the child's parents. Okay, that's got to be the starting point. The ICRC will have people who will try and trace. But if you've got someone who's already in their 20s, who has no idea where they were born, no idea who their parents were, that's not going to happen. At which point, at some point in the process, someone in Southern Africa, and I know the person, they're based in Uganda, okay, who works for UNHCR, will sit down with the government in Zimbabwe and go, you know what? Let's try and work out a law so that these people get some registration. And this is what's happened in Tanzania with the Burundians. It's taken 30 years. But the Burundians are now being given, they're not going back. Particularly the kids. So they're going to become Tanzanians and they're going to vote in Tanzania. And their political participation will change. And maybe Burundi will one day, they'll go back and they'll see it and they'll think, wow, I can reset. And they'll prove who they were because someone will recognize them who knew the grandparents and all that. But for the moment, they're Tanzanians. And at some point, Zimbabwe is going to have to sort of say to ourselves, what are we going to do? And then you get into the question, well, just a minute. How are we going to absorb these people into our economy? Because these questions aren't just about giving people the right documentation. They're about saying, not only are you going to participate politically, but then you're going to have the right to work and the right to go to university and the accessing the healthcare systems. And that costs money. And that's where you go to the World Bank and you say, oi, World Bank, you have 30-year loans, no interest, and basically you can extend the loan for as long as you feel like anyway, so it's a 30-year gift. Okay, and the World Bank does this and says, we need this because we're on the IDA list, International Development Agency's list of countries. And that's how it works. You take international money in order to facilitate the resolution of a human rights problem. And the human rights problem is people shouldn't be stateless. I mean, I can even show it. Here you go. My passport. I'm outside the country, I carry it with me at all times. It says, somewhere at the beginning, yeah, Her Britannic Majesty's Secretary of State requests and requires, in the name of Her Majesty, be nice to me, the Queen says. Right. All those whom it may concern to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. And it even gives me a nice picture of some cottages in Stratford-upon-Avon. It's a really useful document. If you're stateless, you don't get one. Imagine not being forced to move and not being able to identify who you are. I'm the person who gets persecuted. That's who I am. I'm a victim, full stop. That's what you're condemning stateless people to be. Nothing but victims, and they're not. They're the survivors. They're the ones who, within a system that relies on the Westphalian state, even today, manage to work in an international environment with no documentation. That's clever. The person next to you had a question too.
Question. It's a typical example. Tanzania recently expelled I wouldn't call them Ugandans. Well, they migrated from Uganda in the 1930s, settled in Tanzania, but didn't regularize their stay there. So Tanzania expelled them, and Uganda was receiving these people who don't identify with Uganda, but Tanzania was equally not recognizing them. So at that point in time, we were dealing with a situation, the National Human Rights Institution was dealing with a situation of monitoring, the human rights situation in the area where these people were located. And what was challenging was, how to classify them in as far as their status in Uganda was concerned. Luckily, the government of Uganda then chose to, resettle them in a refugee camp so that at least sorted part of the problem. So what I was looking at is the issue of being stateless, that, as far as these people were concerned, they were Tanzanians for all intents and purposes, but the Tanzanians could not take cognizance of that fact because they didn't comply with national law. So I think there's lots that, like you said, there's lots that needs to be done to reconcile these positions and ensure that we do not have situations where someone has no identity.
Yeah, I mean, beautiful problem, but actually it isn't a problem. They were Ugandan. because Uganda recognised them.
Later.
Yeah, later. Now that's the problem. Yeah, okay. What you tend to find is that people migrate for work. Now, I happen to know that at least one of the people sitting in the front row down here isn't a Swiss. Yeah. Yeah, not Swiss. So should we evict him? Now, kick him out. Tell the Swiss authorities, go. No, we're not going to do that. That would be mean. But that's basically what's happening in large parts of the world. The people migrate. The Nigerian. When we were Anna and I were in Niger. Okay. Most of the people we were meeting weren't actually Nigerians. They were Nigerian who were returning, who'd gone to Nigeria for work 30 years ago, got work in Nigeria, grown up, and what worked in Niger was that when they came back, and the entire families were coming back, the chef de village in Niger, village chief, okay, recognised the old man who'd gone over 30 years ago, because village chiefs tend to be old men, seriously. I said, yeah, I knew him. We were at school together. And therefore the entire family was suddenly Nigerian. They weren't Nigerian, they were Nigerian. Because the chef de village, who is a proper person within the administrative system of Niger, okay, had the authority to say, yeah. And remember, I said 60% of the population of around Difa don't have documentation. So that's the fact they didn't have documentation, irrelevant, nor did anybody else. Okay, you were recognised as Nigerian. They all spoke the same language. It wasn't French or English, by the way. Hausa, usually. You get, that's how it works in countries where there is limited documentation. What happens in Europe, and this is why the Syrian diaspora is running into problems, is Europe is so overregulated. So much documentation is needed to do anything. If I fall off this stage and break my leg and go to the hospital, I better have all the right bits of paperwork with me and cards to prove who I am. Other parts of the world, less documented. But statelessness is a tool used by governments to get rid of people on occasions, like kicking the Ugandans out of Tanzania. They chose the right group. Uganda is incredible. Uganda wins the prize. They're the poster child of refugee reception at present. They're doing an amazing job. Okay. But there are other countries around there. No, you're nothing. And you go back and you be stateless. So it's going to be one of those situations where it's going to require advocacy. And that's why UNHCR having the mandate for stateless persons is as important as UNHCR having the mandate for refugees in many cases. But at least because there's an organisation that'll deal with it. That's it, right. How did this presentation on political participation of refugees turn into a massive discussion on statelessness? I've got no problem with it. I mean, I do statelessness as well. I was in Ghana in December last year doing training to the Anglophone West African countries on statelessness. But now, I know Rohingya is sort of popular at the minute, but there's a lot more issues than statelessness and refugee status. And refugees, think about all the problem cases on the planet about participation. Think about long term. Think about that fact I told you that the modal average time for displacement situations is 20 years. That and political participation. You've got experts on transitional justice here. The war in Colombia has lasted 50 years. A 50-year conflict. How does that fit into political participation? And I have no idea how you vote in Colombia. So because there's all those different little bits. Colombia is big. If you haven't looked at Colombia on the map, go and look at on the globe, go and look at it. It's big. Not quite as big as Brazil, but it's big. How do you sort out where people are going to vote? How do you deal with the fact that a large part of the displacement was so that villages could be used for planting lots of things? Sometimes it was cocaine, but in lots of times it was bananas. The large companies in Colombia have basically used the areas that have been cleared of people to build bananas. So now they're going back. There's a thing called the Land Restitution Unit, basically using Victim Law 44 of 2011. I'm looking at my Colombians. Okay. Can I just say, typical male. Okay, doesn't know the answer. Let the women. Yeah, no. Yeah, restitution. You work for the restitution unit? Anybody work for the victims and restitution unit? LRU? Land registration unit? Oh, right, okay. But yeah, I was there, and we went in and we saw them. Okay, but there's part of the problem. How do you deal with land that's been taken from people in violation of their human rights? And now give it back when it's basically a banana plantation. How do you do that? How do you let people go back, chop down those trees? They need homes. Or do you relocate them? Where do you relocate them? Punta Take someone from the north and move them? No. Difficult. Tricky. All these issues to do with political participation. And that's an IDP situation. They're all nationals. They should just vote. How do you do it when I'm here and the election's taking place over here? Oh, yeah, the refugees can start coming back after we've had the elections, because that will mean that we've got a stable government and the refugees will trust us. But we can't let them vote over here, because that might influence how many people get elected over here. Oh, yeah. Now you're beginning to see the pain in the proverbial that is political participation and displacement. Any more questions? Oh, we have another one. Go for it. Statelessness or not?
No.
about the provision on the exception on subversive activities in the AU, against the AU members. So if you're a political refugee or an asylum seeker, and you're exercising your right to political participation, and that is termed something subversive to an AU member because you're obviously in opposition to whatever's happening back home. How does that work out?
So this is Article 3 of the African Convention, governing specific aspects of refugee problem in Africa. Every refugee has duties to the country in which he finds himself. That's Article 2 of the 51 Convention, which require in particular to conform with its laws and regulations as well as with the measures taken for the maintenance of public order. He shall also abstain from any subversive activities against a member state of the OAU. It was the OAU. Back in '69 it was the OAU, now it's the AU. Right. It doesn't actually provide any consequences for that. It just says he shouldn't. So it doesn't mean you lose refugee status. But of course, and this is where life gets a bit more complicated, if I were to take a look at Article 1... 4, I think. Is it 4 or 5? Take a look at Article 1.5. Okay. The provisions of this convention shall not apply to any person with respect to whom the country of asylum has serious reasons for considering that he has been guilty of acts contrary to the purpose and principles of the African Union. Okay. And in Article 1.4g, he has seriously infringed the purposes and objectives of this convention. Well, one of the purposes and objectives of this convention is Article 3, subversive activities. So, yeah. You have the right as a person in Africa living in a country that has ratified the African Charter on Human and People's Rights to freedom of expression. But if you take a look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, it also lays down some duties. Okay, unlike the European Convention on Human Rights, for instance. If your activities are such that you are acting contrary to the purpose and principles of the United Nations, you're undermining the state. Let's say that you are from your refugee camp fomenting crimes against humanity in another country. So I'll use an example from the 1980s. Not the 70s. Khmer Rouge are forced out of Kampuchea, Cambodia. They went across the border into Thailand. From Thailand, they tried to continue the fight. To a certain extent, you can use Interahamwe in DRC after they were kicked out from Rwanda. Same thing. They're not falling within the definition of refugee. They are going to get excluded. They are not going to get protection. Okay. Of course, they still have human rights, which mean that they can't just be arbitrarily detained. They're entitled to a fair trial, all the rest of it. But if they're committing crimes against humanity, or they're giving rise to crimes against humanity through their political activities, then they should be prosecuted. And that's why we've established courts in countries to prosecute those crimes. Okay, and there are issues to do with jurisdiction. Okay, brings me back to my international criminal law. Should a state have the right to prosecute someone for crimes committed outside the territory if they've granted them refugee status? Because if you've granted them refugee status, you can't send them back, because non-refoulement is a principle, is a rule of customary international law. But does that mean that you've got the right to prosecute them? In Germany and Austria, they do. The German and Austrian criminal codes give those countries the right to prosecute in those circumstances. Anna and I have written an article in the Journal of International Criminal Justice on this very issue. Protection gives rise to jurisdiction. Can you usually prosecute your nationals? Can you prosecute refugees? Interesting. So there's the thing. But we've also got the International Criminal Court. Crimes against humanity, International Criminal Court. Prosecute it. That's how you deal with those situations. If you haven't got that stage, it's just pure political participation, and it's not a subversive activity, and we shouldn't be worrying about it. But governments are very, very good at drafting things broadly so as to protect themselves, which is why you've got to learn to think, how am I going to argue this so that the government cannot do what it wants to do? You've got to become mean. Governments are mean. You've got to be mean. If you're going to protect human rights, you've got to think like governments. Because they're the people you're up against. You've got to understand what motivates states. I think I'm being wound up. I think I'm getting the hint that maybe people want to go to bed, let alone go and eat. No.
The opening lecture is a difficult exercise, and it has been, in my view, a model of an opening lecture. You can imagine different opening lectures, but for me it remains as a model because you covered a lot of questions, you opened a lot of roads and tracks, train tracks. I won't forget your image of the picture you are looking at through the window. A lot of wonderful images and a lot of insightful consideration. Thank you very much. Thanks to the students for their questions. Thanks for the audience for its attendance. And hopefully everybody will have a nice term, and looking forward to meeting with you again, and perhaps with Professor Gilbert again this year. Okay, have a nice evening. Thank you. Thank you.